Yeah, why is that, Karl Denninger of market-ticker.org? Why is it that there's this idea that somehow bankers are sacred? And even though historically there have been times when banks have been shut down and new banks forced to open to take their place because of the corruption that we've seen. You know, I'm thinking of the savings and loan crisis, or I'm thinking in Sweden in 1993, for example. Why is it what's this idea that bankers are suddenly godlike and you can't touch them? How did that happen?
Well, one of the goals that the banking industry appears to have is to make sure that their people end up in the halls of government. So you have, for example, Hank Paulson, who was Treasury Secretary and he used to run Goldman Sachs. You now have Tim Geithner, who ran the New York Fed and is now the head of Treasury. And the reality of the situation is that if you force these institutions through a resolution process, through insolvency, then those people are exposed for the parts that they played in allowing this kind of systemic fraud to go on for the time that it did. It's inarguable that Tim Geithner was aware, for example, that in 2007, Citibank was writing 80% of their home loans in an imprudent and insolvent fashion. So you kind of capture the regulatory apparatus by getting your people in there, and then all of a sudden you have this primary Washington thing that goes on, which is the words you will never hear. Those are "I screwed up." Those are three words that never come out of anybody's mouth in Washington, D.C. So the whole goal is to get the revolving door going.
All right, Karl Denninger, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you are one of the co-founders of the Tea Party in the United States. Tea Party, from what I understand, was started to address this very thing. It included guys like Congressman Ron Paul out of Texas, who's been a vocal critic of the entire way the Federal Reserve is set up and the banking system is set up. And so how is that going? Is the Tea Party in a position now to move forward and try to bring about some meaningful banking reform? Is that on the cards for the next couple of years? What's going on there?
Well, we're going to find out. Ron Paul now has the subcommittee chair. It is a subcommittee of finance that in the past has been considered kind of an arcane nothing, but it happens to have, as part of its charter, oversight of the Federal Reserve itself. So we will find out whether or not Mr. Paul is able to cash the checks that he's been writing for the last 20 years. And the argument has always been that the power has not been there, that, he hasn't had the ability to issue subpoenas, for example. He hasn't had the ability to hold his own hearings. Now that's all gone. The excuses are over. Whether the Tea Party is going to be able to actually hold people's feet to the fire, or whether it's just going to become another way of playing what I call the 3 Gs card with the American electorate, which is guns, gays, and God, is an open question. I'm hoping that we see fundamental change. But quite frankly, as long as these so-called too-big-to-fail institutions are allowed to exist in their present constitution and size, it isn't going to change. So someone has to stand forward and say, these institutions, if you're too big to fail, you're too big to bail out, that means you're systemically dangerous and we need to shut you down preemptively. And I don't know that the political will exists, even within the Tea Party, to actually force that sort of a resolution authority on these people. But that's what has to happen.
All right, let's look ahead to the coming year, New Year's Eve. Time to make some predictions. And as I've said, your track record in this area is really good. You go back to your previous postings along the years. You've made some outstanding calls. So let me throw some topics out there and get your take on it. Number one, what's going to be the story for housing coming up this year?
Terrible. The foreclosure mess that has been going on, my prediction there is that they will attempt somehow to retroactively make what's happened with mayors and all of these foreclosure mills legal. I don't believe it's going to work. It implicates states' rights in a way that I do not believe the states will accept. And so there will be an attempt made to solve that problem. I think it blows up in everybody's face next year. The resolution won't come in 2011, but the litigation will get to the point that it can't be ignored anymore.
All right, let's talk about mirrors for a second, because one of your specialties is you kind of forensically get in there and look at the plumbing of how all these components of the system are linked together. Mirrors seems to be, to me, from what I've seen, just kind of created in the last few years to be this huge multi-trillion, billion-dollar slush fund of documents that is just fraud from beginning to end. Can you just talk a little bit about what mirrors is and I guess you're saying is that that's going to blow up, if I'm not mistaken there.
Well, MERS is a way to essentially avoid the recording fees when mortgages change hands. But there's two components to a mortgage. The actual mortgage itself, which can be traded in this sort of a fashion, although in some states that is explicitly against the law. And then there is the actual promissory note, which is your promise to pay. The problem that MERS has enabled is that the promissory notes have to be transferred according to prescribed procedures in order for those transfers to hold up under the Uniform Commercial Code and also under common law. And there's plenty of evidence that hasn't happened. Now, we don't know how widespread that is at this point, but what I have put forward as a theory, and it appears to be becoming increasingly validated, and I started talking about this back in 2007, is that you can't audit what you don't have. And so the entire premise behind this is that if you're going to make liar's loans that people can't pay and you don't want to get caught, you need to run the clock, essentially. You need to keep the documents out of people's hands so they can't see that this has occurred. And that's how you sell this stuff off. And I believe that a large part of what happened with securitization was essentially enabling this kind of wide-scale obfuscation of the truth. It becomes fraud when you misrepresent that to somebody who's buying. If I sell you something and I say, I don't really know what's in this box, would you like to pay $100,000 for it? That's perfectly okay. But if I tell you there's grade A chocolates in there and what's really in there is stuff that came out of the back end of my dog, that's fraud.
Okay. Who's the biggest loser in this? Bank of America?
All of the large banks are potentially huge losers. And in addition to that, there is a problem here with pension funds and everybody else who holds that paper. And that is, for the most part, all Americans through their retirement accounts and their pension funds. And that's one of the reasons it's so difficult to solve this, in that if you actually force this back through the chain and resolve this, the only options you have are that the pension funds and the Americans that invested in these instruments get wiped out, or the banks get wiped out. You have to pick one of the two. The problem is that as the foreclosure process continues to gather steam and people can't make these payments, you're going to get forced to have one of these two resolutions, whether you like it or not. My argument is the people that committed the bad acts should be the ones who eat the losses, not the American public.